Hashem Parsha is Parshas Chukas, and there's a there's the first main part of the story is the story of the Parah Aduma, the red heifer, which is something I'm very interested in, and in fact I made it my focus of my recent trip to Israel, where I went to see the several red heifers that are being raised in the town of Shiloh. But we already discussed that right before Pesach. So today I want to focus on the next part of Parashas Chukas, which is the death of Miriam, but really not the death of Miriam, but really the sin of Moshe Rabbeinu, the sin of Moses. Look at several commentary on the sin of Moshe. Just before we get into that, the Torah tells us that after, I'm going to just give you the background in chapter 20, Torah tells us that Miriam died in the first month, i.e. in the month of Nisan. Miriam's Yortzeit is the 10th of Nisan. And after Miriam died, there was no water to give to the congregation, and they gathered on Moshe and Aaron, and they were upset. They said, we would have rather died. Rashi says any other death is better than death by dehydration. That's the worst type of death. And so God told Moshe to take the staff, gather the people, and speak to the rock. Speak to the rock in front of them. And then after you speak to the rock, you'll have enough water for yourself and for the flock. Moshe took the staff and he gathered Aaron and he and Aaron gathered all the people in front of the rock. And he said, listen now, you rebels. Listen now, you rebels. Shimon Amorim. From this rock shall we draw forth water. Moshe lifts his staff and he strikes the rock twice. And many water and a lot of water gushed forth, and there was enough water to feed everybody. So you might think this is one of the great miracles that Moshe performed. But the very next verse says, God says to Moshe and to Aaron, because you did not sanctify me, Yan lo emantim bi laktisheni, to make me sacred, since you did not believe in me, to sanctify me in the eyes of the people. Therefore, you will not bring this community to the land that I gave to them. And so Rashi, well, let me just stop for a second. So therefore, the two passages are actually two separate passages, because in the Torah, it is a sisuma. So basically, there are two types of breaks in the Torah. There's a psucha and a stuma. And this is a stuma, meaning to say it's not a complete break, but it is a new paragraph. It is a new passage. The idea that God says, you did not sanctify me. So not every commentary says that this sin of Moshe was directly, that the reason Moshe did not go into the land was directly related to the previous incident, which was the hitting of the rock. So it's not necessarily the case that Moshe is being punished for something having to do with the hitting of the rock. It could be something else very specific, or it could be just an overarching message. But Rashi specifically relates it to. Before I get to Rashi, I want to just read from the Baal HaTurim, who speaking in the royal way, we love. I love to read his commentary. And the Baal HaTurim begins our portion in the following manner. The Baal HaTurim begins the portion of Chukas by saying, Zos Chukas HaTorah. And then it says, this is the law of the Torah. And then right after that, it states, meaning to say, in the previous portion, it had said, the last verse of Parshas Korach was, do not desecrate, lo techaruv lo tamusu. You shall not desecrate God's name, and then you will not die. And that is the sin of basically not feeding the sacred food to people who are not allowed to eat it. And the very next verse is telling us this is the laws of the Torah. So the Baal Turim says, what is the connection between these two verses, the end of last week's portion and the beginning of our portion? It's to tell us Talmid Chacham Shechote Uchilul Hashem. And when there's a Torah scholar who sins, it's a desecration of God's name. And right away we see that this is basically one of the themes of our portion, because the portion starts off like that according to Baal Turim, and then we have this major incident where God says, since you do not believe in me, to sanctify my name. And so the sin of Moshe Rabbeinu is the sin really of not sanctifying God's name. That's what the Torah tells us. We don't know what specifically caused it, but when a Torah scholar does something, it's much worse. And the reason is because when people see how the Torah scholars act, then they are going to think, well, if that's the person who studies Torah acts like that, how much, then there's no problem with any of us to act in that similar manner. And so when a Torah scholar sins, it's especially considered to be a desecration of God's name. And so Moshe's sin, right at the very outset, we say that Moshe's sin, even though for us, maybe it would not have been a sin, for us, it might have been a sin, it might not have been a sin, but when you are of the level of Moses, which no other human being will ever be, then Moshe is judged, even kechut hasara, even like the thread of a hair, he's held to a higher standard. It used to be that our political leaders were held to a higher standard. Now they're held to a lower standard. And then but it used to be that if you did a minor infraction, like let's say speeding or something, and you were a political leader, that would be the end of your campaign. But nowadays, we know that that's just simply not the case. So, okay. I would like to first read what Rashi says and then go from there to the other comments. What does Rashi say was the sin of Moshe? Rashi says that the sin of Moshe was specifically this sin. Rashi says that it was specifically this sin. And Rashi says, were it not for this sin, Moshe and Aaron would have entered into the land. Rashi writes in his commentary to verse 12, were not for this sin alone, Moshe and Aaron would have entered in the land. He did not commit the same sins as others. And then Rashi says, well, what about the fact when God says, I'm going to provide meat for the people, and Moshe says, where are you going to get enough sheep and cattle to slaughter for the people? And that was clearly a mistake because he challenged God. So Rashi says that was a sin in private, and he would not have been denied entrance into the land. But this was a sin in front of all of Israel. Kol Yisrael, he did not sanctify God's name. So Rashi doesn't tell us exactly what he didn't do, but the commentaries on Rashi imply that actually Rashi says in the next verse, Rashi says, you did not sanctify my name. Rashi says that if you had spoken to the rock, let me just finish this commentary of Rashi. If you had only spoken to the rock, and would have brought forth water, if you would have spoken to the rock, then I would have been sanctified in the eyes of the community. And they would have said, just like this rock, which does not speak and does not hear and does not need substance, fulfills the word of God, how much more so should we fulfill his word? So Rashi is saying that the sin of Moshe was that God said, speak to the rock, and instead Moshe hit the rock. This is what Rashi says, but it's it's not the only time that Rashi talks about it, because Rashi also talks about it later on. But anyway, from the context over here, Rashi is saying that the sin of Moshe was that he did not sanctify God's name by not listening to God and speaking to the rock, and instead hitting it rock, and so therefore he does not enter into the land. There's a lot of commentaries disagree with that, and we're going to get into that in a moment. But first, we want to hear a question or a comment from Bruce or April. So, from Bruce asked or raises what he said was a basic question, but it's actually a fundamental question: is that which rock are we talking about? Because God said to him, "Speak to the rock," and in fact, all it says is "Sela." He says, "Go speak to the rock." Dibartem ela Sela. So, what's going on? What's going on here? How do we know which rock he's talking about? And in fact, Rashi actually adopts that reading to explain why Moshe disobeyed what God said. God said, speak to the rock, so why is Moshe hitting it? So, first of all, Rashi reads when the verse says in verse 10, gather on Moses and Aaron and say to them, from this rock should we take forth water? Rashi reads it as a question. And Moshe wasn't sure if that was the rock. What happened? Rashi tells us the following. Rashi says to verse 11, at first Moshe struck the rock, and then it only brought forth nothing but a few drops. Because God didn't command Moshe to strike it, but rather God said, speak to the rock. And they spoke to a different rock, and it didn't bring forth water, meaning to say they messed up. They were speaking to a different rock. Why? We'll see why in a moment. But first, let me finish this Rashi. They said maybe it's necessary to strike the rock like we did back in Parashas Beshalach in Exodus 17:6. God says, strike the rock. So Moshe was doubly confused. First of all, he had already once in his lifetime struck a rock to bring forth water. And now he tried speaking to it and nothing came forward. So he said maybe because he was speaking to the wrong rock. So now he said, I have to strike it. And so he struck it. But why couldn't he find the rock? So why did he speak to the wrong rock? So here too, we have to say we have to take Rashi's approach, because Rashi says, Moshe and Aaron in the previous verse, Rashi says, Moshe and Aaron could not identify the rock. Why not? This rock went and hid amongst the other rocks when the well had departed. What well had departed? That all 40 years, Rashi says, that they were in the desert, there was a well on account of Miriam. But now that Miriam had died, this rock went and hid. This rock went and hid. And because the rock went and hid, they couldn't find the rock. And so therefore, since they couldn't find the rock, when he spoke to the rock, nothing happened because he spoke to the wrong rock. And so therefore, he hit it twice. This raises a lot of questions. Why is God confusing Moshe? Why is the rock hiding? Is it Moshe's fault? And what is even going on here? Why did God tell him to hit the rock the first time, and now he says speak to the rock? So this raises a lot of questions and really should cause us to reflect deeply. And to my mind, it's like whenever you have a pattern and then the pattern breaks, it's to teach us something. And And it goes to a much deeper issue, which is Moshe assumed that the same way he had led the people 40 years ago when they left Egypt, and he got water for them by hitting the rock, Moshe assumed that was the same way he was supposed to get water this time. And he wasn't really all in the speaking. He wanted to go back to the hitting. That was his go-to. His go-to was the hitting. Now, probably many people in this Zoom, when they were raised, when they went to school, the teachers hit. Probably some of the people were struck by their teachers, or their teacher had a paddle in their classroom. Nobody had it. I know that some people come and study with me, tell me that that's the case. And God forbid any teacher would hit today, he would get fired on the spot appropriately. So again, Moshe 40 years later wasn't all in on the speaking. He was still in the hitting. Anyway, we'll stop for a second because Rabbi Yosef has something to add, of course. A lot of fundamental questions with Rashi's approach, and the commentary sees on it, which is why he says, you didn't sanctify me, because if only you had spoken to the rock, it would have been a greater sanctification of God's name. Well, why is it a greater sanctification to get water from a rock by speaking to it versus speaking it to it? That's a major question on Rashi. And also, why are we talking about hidden rocks that are hiding? I mean, this is also seems so fanciful. And even if he did all that, it would seem like such a minor error, and it seems unfair to Moshe that he was penalized. So I want to look at other commentaries, but first we have a comment from Morris, and then I'm going to look at some other commentaries. First of all, the Gemara in Shabbos tells us, when it says, Yan lo imantem bi, because you did not sanctify me, it says, Ein misa below chait. There's no death without sin. And even Moses and Aaron died as a result of their sin. It's not 100%. It's not 100% because the Talmud tells us in Baba Basra 17a, the Talmud tells us that there are 4 who died as a result of the sin of the serpent. Meaning to say, there are 4 examples of people who did not sin. But the common denominator, if you look at all those 4 people, was like Benjamin, the father of David, Yishai, Caleb, Kilab, was that none of them were the leaders. Moshe was the leader. So it's impossible for a leader to be correct in every single decision he makes. And so we have to realize that when we're talking about Moses and we're talking about his sin, what he did would not be considered a sin if we did it. If we had done that, it would have almost certainly been the greatest thing that any of us ever could do in our life. And when we're talking about Moshe Rabbeinu, the leader of the leaders, the greatest human being ever, then he's held to a much different standard. And so let me first, before we go to the classic commentaries, since we have the Baal HaTurim open in front of us, I want to share with you what the Baal HaTurim says. It's ironic. The Baal HaTurim says when he struck the rock, Vayachat Hasel, he struck the rock. Baal HaTurim has a beautiful comment. He struck one rock, V'nivku kol hatzurim shebamidbar. All the rocks of the wilderness, in the wilderness split. As it says, Yivakat Tzurim bamidbar, Psalm 78:15. So what's the significance of that? I think it's to highlight that, first of all, this is like the splitting of the sea almost, that Moshe is going back at the very beginning of his career, so to speak. He split the sea and he separated the water. And this is a tremendous miracle, which we should not glide over. And then God says, because you did not sanctify my name. And then the verse uses lachein, therefore, you will not bring this community to the land that I gave to them. And the word therefore, Baal HaTurim notes, has a gematria, a numerical value of 100, which is the same as mida b'mida, measure for measure. So it seems to say that Moshe was being punished that he did not sanctify, that since he did not sanctify God's name, therefore he would not be allowed to enter into the land. And that was a punishment of measure for measure. But he doesn't say how. He doesn't say how this is a measure for measure punishment. So the commentaries on the Baal Turim explain that maybe Hashem's plan was for Moshe to sanctify God's name in two ways. First, by causing the water to flow from the rock as a result of God's verbal command delivered through the mouth of Moshe. And that act of sanctification would then provide Moshe with the merit that would permit him to sanctify Hashem's name again by bringing Bnei Israel into the land. But Moshe didn't do it. He didn't speak. He struck it instead of speaking. And as a result, he didn't sanctify God's name by having it done through the oral command. And so therefore, as a consequence, he was also denied the right to sanctify God's name by entering into the Holy Land. And so therefore, if you read it this manner, it's Moshe's punishment is not random. It's directly related. He didn't sanctify God's name in that manner. And so therefore, he was denied the opportunity to sanctify God's name by bringing the people into the land. I see, hold on, we have a question here. Let me just, from Bruce or April. So April has raised a classic question on Rashi, which is, if as Rashi says, Moshe disobeyed God, then if that's the case, why did water come forth from the rock? You know, if God would tell us to do something and we didn't listen, why did the water come out? So this is why Nachmanides Ramban, writing in the 13th century, directly challenges Rashi. Let me read a little bit of Nachmanides. Nachmanides is very hard to fully understand, but I'll start by pointing out that Nachmanides says, it says in verse 8, take the staff in your hand. So if he's not, why else would he take the staff? Unless he's supposed to be using it. So Nachmanides points out that back in book of Exodus, chapter 7, Moshe was told to take the staff because he's going to strike the water in the Nile with it. Now, it doesn't really make sense that God would take something, give him the staff, which he told him in the past to use to hit the people, to hit the rock to get water. And now it's like he's setting him up for failure. And then it says, oh, because you messed up, you don't go into the land. That seems cruel. So the reason why Nachmanides says he was told to take the staff in his hand is because he's going to use it. And also, Nachmanides says, why is speaking to the rock any greater a miracle than hitting it? It's all the same to the rock. The rock has no water in it. Why is it a greater miracle to say, Mr. Rock, will you please produce water, or then to strike the rock and the water to come forward? So Nachmanides writes that the problem could not be that they did not speak as they were commanded to the rock, because Moshe and Aaron gathered the people in front of the rock, al Pnei Sela, and Moshe told them they would get water from the rock. So Moshe did say, we'll get water from the rock. So the rock certainly heard them speak this. And the rock was a witness. So it can't be like Rashi is saying. Nachmanides directly rejects Rashi. He says, it can't be like Rashi is saying that the sin was that they hit the rock instead of speaking it. So Nachmanides says there's a lot of commentary about this, and there's a lot of many claims as to what was Moshe's sin. And he says Ibn Ezra has disposed most of them. If we have time, hold on, let's see. Are you saying so? Bill is saying don't punish people for the mistake of Moses, so therefore the water should still come forth. That's a very good point. But God could have brought forth water in many ways. He brought it through this through the actions of Moses. Could have just caused them to discover a well. So anyway, Ibn Ezra has a lot of a big discussion. If we get through Nachmanides, we could go to Ibn Ezra. But first, Nachmanides rejects Ibn Ezra also. He says the sin would have been, well, we'll come back to that, but he says, Nachmanides writes, and he attacks Ibn Ezra also, which we'll get back to that in a moment, but he says the most plausible explanation is that of Rabbeinu Hananel. Rabbeinu Hananel was from Kirawan, North Africa, and he wrote that the sin of Moses and Aaron was their suggesting that they were the ones to get water from the rock. They say, Hamin hasela hazeh notzi lachem mayim. It's as though they were the ones getting the water from the rock. If the people thought that Moshe and Aaron had themselves figured out how to do this, they thought, oh, the water was coming not from God, but from Moshe and Aaron. Well, then they lost the opportunity to truly sanctify God's name. And that would be a violation against God in the technical meaning of the term, because they would be taking credit for something which was actually belonging to God. But then Nachmanides says, even though that's the most plausible, Nachmanides writes something here. He writes, the actual truth is that this is one of the great mysteries of the Torah. It's one of the great mysteries of the Torah. We don't really know what Moshe Rabbeinu did wrong. In the original case, when God told Moses, I will be standing before you on the rock at Horeb, strike the rock and the water will come forth. What he meant by I was my great name, the presence of God, which appeared as a consuming fire. That's why there Moshe struck it only once. But here God told him nothing. So he and Aaron agreed that he better strike it twice, because there God was there. So their sin is stated quite plainly in the text. As it states in Psalms, it was God of Jacob who turned the rock into a pool of water. So you can also see that Moshe's own plea was to be allowed to be crossed into the land which he addresses to the great name. Okay, so Ramban is basically saying, he's throwing up his hands, and he's saying, really, none of these sins which people claim was a sin is a sin. He has a hard time with it. The most plausible one is that he took credit for what he really didn't do. The very long Ibn Ezra, which also discusses this. Ibn Ezra is also the 11th century commentary. But before we get to Ibn Ezra, we have to just say that Maimonides says, we have to know the explanation of Maimonides. Maimonides says that the sin of Moshe was that he lost his temper. And he says, listen now, you rebels, Shimuna Morim, and he struck the rock twice. These are all indications that he lost his temper. And a great man like Moshe, a leader, once you lose your temper like that in front of the community, that's clearly was an indication that he had it. You know, like he was short-tempered, he wasn't feeling it anymore. And that's, you know, I think the overarching question, the overarching answer is, Moshe, it was time to step aside. Sometimes even the greatest human being ever has to step aside. He wasn't right. He wasn't the right man for the job anymore. He had to leave it to his assistant, Joshua, to take over for him. So that's just the the short answer. That's the short answer. Yes. And then I'll read from Ibn Ezra, but first we'll take some from Aya, a point from Aya. Ibn Ezra says the first of all, it says, take the staff, you and your community, you and Aaron, your brother, speak to the rock, vinatan meimav, and it will yield its water. So he says, first of all, why does it say its water? Why does it say its water? So it should say water. What do you mean its water? So this is what I'm just going to quote to you what Ibn Ezra says. He says, the fact that the verse says its water has misled many into thinking that this rock must have been the same rock that Moshe got water from in Exodus chapter 17, that there's one rock in the wilderness that gives forth water, and it's its water. He writes, but these people are dense. He does not, he does not mince words. That rock was at Chorev, while this one is at Kadesh. So they're not the same rock. It's a totally different place. Now, why is Moshe punished for this episode? He's going to go through a lot of the different explanations. One explanation is that his sin was addressing the Israelites as you rebels. He called the people you rebels. He basically disrespected the people. Who are these people he was calling them rebels? They weren't rebels. They were, in fact, the descendants of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. They were princes. They were the princes, not rebels, and he disrespected them. But if that's the case, says Ibn Ezra, I reject that. Ibn Ezra says if that's his sin, we reject that, says Ibn Ezra, because also in Deuteronomy chapter 9, he calls them rebels. Let me just quote that pasuk for you. Hold on. It says in Deuteronomy chapter 9, Deuteronomy chapter 9, it says, he says, Mamrim hayitem im Hashem, you are rebellious with God. So there too, they're referred to as rebels, and that's not considered a great sin. So Ibn Ezra does not like that answer. Others, argue that they're not being told to order the rock to give water, but smiting, meaning to say that the word dibartem does not mean speak, but it comes from the root dever, meaning like a plague. And so were Moses and Aaron he has a big problem with that. He says, were Moses and Aaron being instructed to kill off the rock? And if Moses was really told to strike the rock, why would he be punished? So their response is that Moshe was supposed to strike the rock, because it says dibartem, which doesn't mean speak, it means hit, but his mistake was that he struck it twice. So if that's the case, he asks another huge question here, which everybody has to deal with. So then what did Aaron do wrong here? If you're saying that the text is referring to what Moshe and Aaron both did here, if the mistake was that Moshe hit the rock twice when he's supposed to only hit it once, why is Aaron being punished? So then we have Jikatila, Moshe Jikatila. He says, let me read. Jikatila says the following: some miracles are invoked by speech alone, some by speech and action. Basically, like when Elisha threw salt into the Mayan and said, I heal this water. No, God says, I heal this water. So meaning you need both things. You need speech and water, speech and action. And so therefore, Hashem told Moshe, take the rod to hit the rock, but he said, speak to the rock to produce water, doing speech and action. And so what was his sin? So Moshe's question to Bnei Yisrael was prompted by his anger at them. And so he says, we have no ability to get water from a rock. It can only be done by the power of God. But he didn't make this clear to Bnei Yisrael. He didn't make it clear to Bnei Yisrael that all had to come from God and not from him. So some of them thought he meant that God could not get water from the rock. And that's what Hashem meant when he said that you failed to uphold my name. So all that's Chikatilla, but Ibn Ezra rejects that also, because since Moshe is the one who said it, why is Aaron punished? Okay, so one more approach that he offers and rejects was actually I'll just say one more he says is that since a rock cannot hear, the rock can't hear, therefore the only way you can get the rock to act was by hitting it. So he was correct. So therefore, why was he punished for it? So Ibn Ezra says another approach, and this relates to what Morris said, that they should have sung the praises of God, but they didn't join in Deuteronomy 21 and Numbers 21 in singing the praise. Another possible punishment that he lists here was that both Moshe and Aaron should have spoke to the rock, but they didn't do that. He just hit it. Okay. Anyway, Ibn Ezra gives a whole bunch of other explanations. And then he says, now I will reveal the explanation that I think is correct. And then he writes, I'm just going to hint to it. I'm not going to give you the whole thing. And he writes as follows. You must understand that when a part knows the whole, it cleaves to the whole and can perform wonders by means of the whole. So God told Moses and Aaron to speak to the rock, but they did not do so because of the people's quarreling with Moshe. The part therefore remained a part. He struck the rock, but no water came forth until he had struck it a second time. So anyway, Ibn Ezra sometimes does this, probably maybe a few dozen times. He just hints to it, and it's a mystical explanation, or perhaps sometimes it's borderline heretical explanation, but he's basically saying that he should have said nothing until he had performed the task assigned to him from God. His mistake was in speaking first before doing it. He should have first done it, and then he would have been able to speak. I don't know. That's, as Nachmanides says, this is a little bit harsh. I mean, it's a little bit strange also. Just share one more explanation, which is from Bechor Shor, that they made it sound like it was a coincidence, that maybe this is the rock that will give forth water, because there were some rocks which water flowed out from. But instead of saying, this will be the rock that God will make the miracle, and so thereby they denied the miraculous when it was an opportunity to show the miraculous by saying, this will be the rock. Anyway, I showed a lot of different explanations, and they're all mysterious because none of them is fully sufficient. Here we have this great leader, gave his whole life to this cause. In the end, there's something that's a borderline sin, and his whole life dream is denied. So that's why I read this text as saying, I read this incident as saying, first of all, Moshe, it was time for new leadership to take them to the next level. But also, more than that, Moshe couldn't go into the land. He needed to be, if he would have gone into the land, it would have been a disaster. All of a sudden, Moshe would have been in the land. He would have been involved with the daily nitty-gritty of leading urban life, the traffic lights, this, that. No, Moshe needed to be on top of the mountain. He needed to have the big picture. He could never cross over into the land. It would have been it would have been Moshe Rabbeinu would have been very hard to remain as the greatest human being ever if he was actually in the land. Anyway, there's a lot more to talk about this, but God willing, we'll stop here now. Siyata Dishmaya, Baruch Hashem. Thanks for discussing. I'll take any questions you have at this time. Yes, of course. I see your hand. I see your hand.